Ethan cross-trudged through the relentless snowstorm, the icy wind biting at his exposed cheeks. His thermal suit kept him alive, but barely comfortable, as the brutal cold of the remote exoplanet, designated as Gliese for 79C, threatened to penetrate every layer of insulation. The planet was a frozen wasteland, its landscape stark and alien, a desolate expanse of jagged ice formations, swirling snow, and an ever-present, eerie aurora that danced across the starless sky. The air was thin, the silence oppressive, broken only by the muffled crunch of his boots sinking into fresh snow. Ethan's mission was straightforward, if lonely: survey the planet for potential colonization. Humanity's reach had extended far into the galaxy, but viable worlds were scarce, and this icy hellscape was a long shot at best. Still, he pressed on, scanning and collecting data with his handheld analyzer. The equipment beeped faintly, indicating mineral deposits beneath the ice, potential resources for future settlers. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the storm intensified, Ethan decided to head back to his base camp, a small tent equipped with just enough technology to keep him alive in the harsh conditions. Visibility was almost non-existent, and he navigated by the faint beacon of his tent's locator signal. Then something caught his eye. Faint tracks. Ethan stopped, kneeling in the snow to examine them. The footprints were unusual, delicate, almost bird-like, but too large for any known Earth species. They seemed to stagger, as if whatever had left them was struggling. Against his better judgment, curiosity got the better of him. He adjusted his visor, following the trail. The tracks led him to a small hollow where the snow had partially collapsed, revealing a figure. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't human. The alien girl lay half-buried in the snow, her body motionless. She had a humanoid form, 2 arms, 2 legs, but her features were distinctly otherworldly. Her skin was translucent, shimmering faintly like frosted glass, and glowing, bioluminescent veins coursed beneath the surface. Her hair, if it could be called that, was a soft, ethereal halo of silver tendrils. Ethan dropped to his knees, instinctively checking for signs of life. Her body was cold to the touch, unnaturally so, and her chest barely rose and fell. She was alive, but only just. Damn it, Ethan muttered, glancing at the storm around him. He knew the risks. Bringing her back could jeopardize his mission, but leaving her here was a death sentence. His gut churned with indecision, but his hands were already moving, scooping her up carefully. She was lighter than he expected, almost weightless in his arms. Back at the tent, Ethan placed her on the insulated floor, his breath fogging in the confined space. He activated the thermal heater and wrapped her in emergency blankets, the soft hum of the equipment a stark contrast to the raging storm outside. As minutes passed, her glow began to return faintly. Ethan watched her, torn between fear, fascination, and an inexplicable sense of responsibility. Suddenly, her eyes fluttered open, revealing luminous, otherworldly pupils that seemed to pierce straight through him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ethan exhaled, realizing just how far he'd stepped into the unknown. Ethan watched as the alien girl stirred beneath the emergency blankets, her glowing eyes flickering open like twin moons emerging from behind clouds. She sat up slowly, her translucent skin faintly illuminated by the thermal heater. Her gaze darted around the cramped tent, sharp and wary. When her eyes locked onto Ethan, they held a mix of confusion and guarded curiosity. "It's okay," Ethan said softly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. He doubted she understood the words, but tone and body language were universal, or so he hoped. The girl shifted slightly, pulling the blanket tighter around her, as though shielding herself from both the cold and his presence. She spoke for the first time, her voice melodic and alien. The sounds were like a song carried on the wind, beautiful but incomprehensible. Ethan frowned, realizing he'd need help to bridge the communication gap. Reaching into his survival kit, he pulled out a portable translator device. It wasn't perfect, it could barely handle most alien dialects, but it was better than nothing. He pointed to himself. "Ethan, he said clearly, then repeated the name. The girl hesitated, then mimicked his gesture, pointing to herself. Her voice came again, softer this time. Aravai. Ethan smiled, nodding. Aravai. Got it? He repeated her name a few times, and the faint tension in her posture seemed to ease. Progress. Through halting words and gestures, aided by the translator, Ethan pieced together fragments of her story. Aravai belonged to a nomadic alien species adapted to survive in extreme cold, moving across icy worlds like this one in search of resources. She had been traveling with her group when a sudden storm separated her, leaving her stranded and vulnerable. She underestimated the planet's ferocity, the storm stronger than anything she had ever encountered. As Aravai spoke, Ethan noticed her bioluminescent veins pulsing faintly, almost in rhythm with her words. She radiated warmth differently than humans did, absorbing heat and storing it in some biological process that made her glow brighter as her body recovered. He realized she wasn't just warming up, she was visibly healing. Ethan shared snippets of his own story in return. He told her about Earth, his home, and how humanity had pushed outward into the galaxy. He spoke of his solitary mission, his purpose as an explorer, and the emptiness he carried with him, a loss he didn't elaborate on but couldn't fully hide. Aravai's expression softened as she listened, her glowing eyes reflecting a surprising depth of empathy despite the language barrier. As the hours passed, Ethan learned more about her species. Aravai explained that her kind relied on communal warmth to survive, sharing body heat as a form of bonding and survival. It was a stark contrast to the human instinct for individuality and self-reliance. Ethan felt a pang of isolation as she described this. Her reliance on others was something he had abandoned long ago. The confined tent became a space of quiet understanding, each of them learning about the other's world in the flickering warmth of the heater. Though separated by biology and culture, Ethan and Aravai found common ground in their shared vulnerability. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir within him, a connection, fragile but real. The storm outside began to relent, the howling wind fading to a mournful whisper. Ethan peeked through the small window of his tent, the landscape beyond an endless, glittering white expanse under the pale light of the auroras. The relative calm should have been a relief, but Aravai's sudden unease told him otherwise. She sat upright, her bioluminescent veins dimming as her gaze darted toward the tent's entrance. Her entire body stiffened, her glowing pupils narrowing like a predator sensing danger. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked, though he didn't expect an answer he could understand. Aravai pointed at the thermal heater, her expression urgent. She muttered something in her melodic language, frustration flashing across her face when he failed to comprehend. Realizing she needed a way to communicate, Ethan grabbed the translator. Aravai spoke quickly, her voice tense, and the device stuttered out a fragmented translation. "Danger. Hunters drawn to heat." Ethan frowned. "Hunters?" Aravai gestured to the tent's interior, then mimicked the predatory movements of some large creature, her hands curling into claws. The translator offered a single word, "Cryivores." The name alone sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. From what he gathered, these predators roamed the planet, relying on heat signatures to locate prey. His tent, warmed to save Aravai's life, was practically a beacon in the cold. "We need to hide our heat," Ethan muttered, his mind racing. He looked at Aravai, who was already moving. She motioned for him to follow as she demonstrated how her people concealed themselves. Using her hands and the translator, she explained how to insulate their shelter with packed snow to mask the heat signature and suggested dimming the heater to the lowest setting. They worked quickly, despite the biting cold. Ethan shoveled snow over the tent's exterior, forming a thick insulating layer while Aravai adjusted the heater, her glowing veins dimming further to conserve her energy. They moved in synchrony, an unspoken understanding forming between them despite the language barrier. Just as they finished, a distant, guttural roar echoed across the frozen wasteland. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat. Another roar answered, closer this time. Aravai grabbed his arm, her luminous eyes wide with urgency. The cryivores had found them. Without a word, Ethan packed what little gear he could carry, and the two slipped out of the tent, leaving the insulated structure behind as bait. Aravai led the way, her familiarity with the terrain evident as she guided him through jagged ice formations and snow-covered ridges. Ethan relied on his survival gear to keep up, his heart pounding as the sounds of pursuit grew closer. Their luck ran out when one of the creatures, a massive, quadrupedal beast with ice-blue scales and steaming breath, appeared on the ridge above them. It snarled, its glowing eyes fixed on their heat signatures. "Run!" Ethan shouted, shoving Aravai forward. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then obeyed, her lithe form darting across the ice. Ethan fired his thermal disruptor, the blast temporarily disorienting the cryivore, but it quickly regained its focus, charging after them. During the chase, Ethan slipped on the icy ground, crashing hard against the frozen surface. The cryivore lunged, its claws raking toward him, but Aravai turned back, releasing a piercing, harmonic cry that caused the creature to falter. Seizing the opportunity, Ethan scrambled to his feet, shielding Aravai with his body as they fled into a narrow crevasse. They finally found temporary safety in a shallow cave, the cryivore unable to follow. Ethan collapsed against the wall, his arm bleeding from where the beast's claws had grazed him. Aravai knelt beside him, her glowing hands hovering over the wound, a silent expression of gratitude and concern etched across her alien features. For Ethan, the pain was worth it. Their bond had solidified in the frozen chaos, each risking everything for the other. In this hostile world, they had become each other's lifeline. The cave led to something Ethan hadn't expected, an ancient alien structure buried beneath layers of ice. Its smooth, curved walls glowed faintly with an ethereal light, a stark contrast to the harsh, jagged wilderness outside. Aravai stopped in the threshold, her luminous eyes wide with recognition. She placed a trembling hand against the wall, her glowing veins pulsing faintly, as if the structure itself welcomed her home. "This was yours," Ethan said quietly, watching her expression shift from exhaustion to awe. Aravai nodded, gesturing for him to follow as she stepped inside. The interior was minimal but intact, a refuge left behind by her people. The temperature was noticeably warmer, the air tinged with a faint metallic tang. Ethan set his gear down, his shoulders sagging with relief. For the first time since their flight from the cryivores, he felt safe. As they settled in, Ethan treated the shallow wound on his arm while Aravai explored the structure, her fingers brushing over symbols etched into the walls. She looked over her shoulder and gestured for him to sit, her movements deliberate and calm. When Ethan complied, Aravai knelt before him and began to sing. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a series of resonant tones that echoed softly through the chamber. It wasn't just a song, it was a story, a language of emotion that transcended words. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. He didn't need a translator to understand the meaning. Gratitude, trust, and a bond forged in the frost of a hostile world. When the song ended, Aravai gazed at him expectantly, her glowing pupils searching his face for a response. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, a worn photo of Earth. The image showed a green field beneath a bright blue sky, a reminder of the world he rarely thought of anymore. "This is my home," he said, holding it out to her. "It's not much, but it means something to me. I want you to have it." Aravai took the photo carefully, her glowing hands cradling it as if it were a priceless treasure. She studied the image, her expression softening, then looked back at Ethan with a nod of understanding. Their moment of peace was interrupted by a faint sound outside the structure, a rhythmic hum, growing louder. Aravai stood quickly, her eyes narrowing as she recognized it. A search party. Her people had found her. Ethan followed her to the entrance, where shapes emerged from the storm. Aravai's people were similar to her, glowing, ethereal beings adapted to the cold. They greeted her with a mix of relief and reverence, But their alien gazes lingered on Ethan, assessing the human who had saved one of their own. As the storm abated, Ethan realized his mission was nearing its end. His data was complete, his time on the planet almost up. Eravai turned to him, her hand outstretched, inviting him to join her people. Ethan hesitated, his heart pulling in two directions: the solitary path he had always walked, or the possibility of something new, something shared. The story ended where it began, on the icy surface of an alien world. Eravai placed her hand against Ethan's, her glowing fingers against his frostbitten glove, their differences and connection starkly clear. Ethan's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Out here in the cold, I found something warmer than I'd ever known.